president of the Historical Society, and welcome to another one of our programs. We have programs here, 6 or 7 programs a year. This is the first program of 2025, and we're very pleased to have this program, which is a recording of an oral interview with Gert Gonyo that was done by Richard, who's the man behind the camera, sometime last year, I believe. 2 years ago. He's been very busy editing, and finally got this one done, and we're pleased to be able to show it. So Reg Wilcox is here, and he's going to give an introduction about this particular program and Gert. So I'll turn this over to you, Reg.
Thank you, Paige. Well, welcome everyone. I'm really glad to be here again and not having to do much talking, so this makes it really easy. But some of you have read, I'm sure, the story of Robert and Gertrude Burns that was authored by me and my sister and brother and published in the Harkener. So that's available. What I didn't know until, a number of years ago, I guess, that Gert Burns' niece is Gertrude Gonyo, who's with us tonight. And Richard, our videographer, actually interviewed her 2 years ago up on the Burns property. So I'm going to learn a lot tonight, I am sure. And with her is her daughter Jeanette and her son-in-law Joe. And I want to welcome you to our March meeting. I'm so glad you took the time to come up and be here. So the video is going to be shown. It's going to be recorded with her answers. For people that aren't able to be here, they can actually, we'll have that address so they can go see us. So Gert, I'm thrilled you're here, and I want to hear as many stories as you possibly can tell us, both in the video and in the answers. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Gertrude Gonyo, and back in my childhood, I had the great pleasure of being up in Cambridge at the top of Cady Hill on Tip Top Farm, and spent my summer vacation with my Aunt Gertrude Burns and my Uncle Robert Burns. While I was here, I started about 11 years old. And why did I want to come here? My brother, who was 4 years older than I was, he spent some of his summers here. And me, being the bratty little sister that I am, wanted to be here because he was here. So that they were very gracious to me, and I came up here and spent every summer until I was about 17. So this started when about the mid 1940s and ended in the very early 50s. I would come up just about as soon as school let out. Couldn't wait to get here. And my aunt and uncle treated me like their very own daughter. My uncle was a very, very neat man. He had his barn clothes, but when he went to town, he was dressed in a 3-piece suit. Also, the car was always spotless. Yes, it was a dirt road, but when that car came home, it was always washed immediately, and there was never a spot on it. He, when he went to town, also was very precise in what he was doing. He ran a farm like a real business. And I wonder if many people realize back then that you still had to have all of your accounts in order. And I would see him at night, go into his desk and write and make sure that everything was where it should be so that it was a profitable running farm. He had purebred Jersey cattle, and that is what he stuck with. Why? They have a higher butterfat content, which meant he got more for his milk than some of the other breeds of cows that do not have that type of butterfat content in their milk. He was a World War I veteran. He was in France, overseas, and he was wounded in his leg with a piece of shrapnel. He had a buddy by the name of Donald Brown who actually saved his life. Found eggs for him to eat, other things to eat, because back in World War I, you could easily die of a wound. He got him out of there and saved his life. And Rob said, Don, if you ever need a place to live, I have a farm, and my home is your home. And in later years, Don did come, and he lived out his life here on the farm. The other thing about, to show what happened in World War I that a lot of people do not realize, was Rob left here with a full head of hair. He came back bald. That is what World War I was one of the things that did him. I never knew him to have what is known as PTSD. He never talked much about the war. I never heard him or Don ever reminisce anything about their time in the service or World War I. My aunt was a lovely person, the same way as my mother. They were sisters, and I was named after my aunt, and I don't think I could ever live up to her name. She was a great pastry cook, and one time she made cupcakes, and she put them in a tin in her little area where she used to do all of her cooking. And I was hungry in the afternoon, and I went in there when she wasn't around, and I opened that tin because I was going to have a cupcake. What do you think I saw on the top of those cupcakes? Do not touch. These are for supper. Okay, I didn't dare touch them. I put the cover back on and I walked away. But she was well known for her angel food cakes. And anytime there was a food sale down at the village, wherever it was, she had to make an angel food cake. And of course, they had chickens, so it had to be egg whites, all from scratch, and she would turn out these beautiful angel food cakes. Her pies also were beyond compare. And naturally, we never bought bread. She made every bit of homemade bread. Everything was homemade. And you know, as a child, you take that for granted. But later on in life, you wish you had some of it. I have a good one here of Aunt Gert and Uncle Rob up here on the lawn. Just a nice, pretty picture. And I don't know when that was taken, but you know, you can always see my aunt always had her hand on Uncle Rob, wanting to make sure he was all right. And she had a favorite endearment that she called him, my Horum. And she'd call him my Horum. And I says, what does that mean? And she said, Horum means my darling in Old English language. I was a type of person that had to be very busy. So they immediately gave me chores to do. I started by, if there was a garden, I was picking peas in the garden. And I hated picking peas because they were low bush peas. And you know how Cady Hill is made of hills and dips. And I couldn't see the end of the row. So I always thought that I was never going to get to the end of the row of those peas. And then, of course, I had to shell them. And I did that. And and there was a beautiful currant bush on the side of the horse barn. And I had to pick the currants, pick those off, help my aunt with things like that. And snip the beans, that sort of thing. And when she was cooking, because they made their own maple syrup. She had maple sugar down cellar. It was in a kind of a round container that was made of wood and had a cover on it, and I would go down with a cup, get her the cup of maple sugar that she wanted, and bring it back up. And that was about it in the house. I didn't help my aunt much. I wanted to be outdoors. I wanted to be where the cows were, where the haying was, where everything was going on. So we had milking time. And in milking, they had a cow dog named Teddy. And when it was time to milk, my uncle said, I know what Gertrude can do. She can go up and get the cows. So I would take Teddy. And because I loved horses, and he had work horses, but the one that I used, and I'll tell you about that in a few minutes, I could put a saddle on. And I would go up with Teddy, be the cowgirl, and round up the cows. And Teddy would come down with those cows along with me, and he'd look those cows over, just like a sheep dog looks over the sheep. If one was gone, away he'd go to get that cow. All right, so we bring the cows in. All right, I wasn't here very long, but because they had a milking machine, there were other things to do in the milk barn. It meant stripping the cows. It also meant washing the udders on the cows to put the milking machines on, so I learned how to do that. Now, this is back before you had milk trucks coming up to get the milk. As a result, they went into milk cans, and he had this big refrigerated, I guess you'd say, I don't know what you would call it, but it was full of ice water. And down would go the milk cans in that ice water. And they would stay there until the following morning, when they would take them to the creamery every day. So from there, we had haying season. What do we do during haying season? Well, everything here was done by horses. There wasn't a tractor on this farm. Uncle Rob always said, why could I use a tractor on this farm? With the stones, with the hills, with the valleys, I'd turn a tractor upside down in a New York minute. So we would go out, and I learned how to rake the hay. That was done with a dump rake. The dump rake was made with two large wheels. In between the two wheels on the back of the seat were these tongs that were curved, and they would come down behind the seat. And in the front was a shaft for a horse, of course. And I had to learn how to take care of that horse, how to harness that horse, put him between the shafts, and learn how to do raking. So, my uncle would mow the grass. We'd let it dry. I would go out with a dump rake, and I would rake just so far and watch very carefully that the rake would fill up with hay. Then there was a pedal on the front. I would hit that pedal, and the dump rake would come up and leave a nice windrow of hay and go on to the next one. Now, I was very careful to make sure those windrows of hay were all in a beautiful line. Along comes somebody, and what are they going to do with those windrows? Each windrow was just long enough where you had a pitchfork with 3 prongs on it. And what would happen is you would take one end of that windrow, put it over in the middle. You take the other end of that windrow, put over in the middle. Now this is each one that the dump rake did. Take a pitchfork in the middle, and it went up on the hay wagon. All right? And there would be somebody up there to put them in the exact place on the hay wagon. When the hay wagon was full, it came down here, and there below this house was where the cows were stabled in the winter, where they were milked. But upstairs was the hay mow. And there was a big ramp that would go up. He had 2 big, white, beautiful work horses named Prince and Ned. And Ned and Prince would back that hay wagon full up that ramp. That was very interesting to see. He'd back that right up there so straight, and they would take the hay off, and we'd start over again. After haying, he would get in the oats. He always raised oats for the horses. And he would get in the oats. And he had a timeline in his mind. And he used to brag he would be all done haying and all done with oats by the 4th of July. Okay? And at that time, he would put the horses out to pasture. But one other thing, during the haying season, those horses got thirsty. So he would take those horses by the bridle, the two big white horses that he had, Ned and Prince, and he'd bring them down to the watering trough. The watering trough was right outside the barn, and they would be in a hurry to get there. And my uncle would grab each bridle, take his feet off the ground, and he got a free ride all the way to the watering trough. They'd carry him all the way there. Okay, so they would get their drinks, and he would give them grain, and he would put them out to pasture without even a bridle on them at the end of haying, and you never saw them again until it got so cold in the wintertime there was no water for them. They'd freeze over. So he would come along, and they would come down to the gate, and they would wait, and he would let them in, and they would stay in the barn the rest of the winter. Now, after the horses got let out, they had their rest, and Rob wanted his rest. And he had his breeding program set up so that every cow was dry before she was going to freshen again, having a calf in the summer for 2 weeks, so that he and Aunt Gert could take a vacation. And they would. They would maybe go away because there were usually his brother, Bert Burns, also lived here, and there was always somebody to look after the farm. And the other thing I said I would talk to you about is later on taking the milk to the creamery. I got my license, and before the license, though, he had a Model A car. And I wanted to learn to drive before I could ever get a license. So we would come up Cady Hill, and he'd put me behind the wheel, and he would sit on the passenger side with the door open, ready to jump in case I went off the road. However, I never did, and I learned to drive on a Model A Ford. Later on, he got a Jeep. By the time I got my license, then he was happy to let me take the milk to the creamery. Why? I was a girl. I didn't have to lift any milk cans. There was always a willing man there to take the milk cans and wait for the ones that were all clean, and away I'd come back up to the farm with clean milk cans. Not only was milking done here, but also they had a sugar place, and they had a sugar house, and I don't know how many trees they tapped, but they got a lot of nice syrup. Now, how was that gathered? It was gathered by tapping the trees, hanging a bucket on them, and in order to gather the sap, here comes Ned, here comes Prince, dragging a beautiful sleigh with a gathering tank on it, and you would take the sap bucket off the spout, pour it into the gathering tank, and put the bucket back on the spout. Now, back then there wasn't a lot of technology of how did you know when the syrup was ready. Well, both Bert Burns and Rob Burns had boiled, I'm sure, under their father for years. And all they would have to do was take the ladle of the syrup and pour it and look at it. Yep, ready to go into the milk can. How did they get rid of it? I don't know, but I think they sold it in bulk. And Rob said that paid for all the real estate taxes on the farm, the syrup. Oh, I have some pictures here, not many because we didn't take pictures back in those days, but here I am in pigtails, sitting in an Adirondack chair with my arms here, and I had a kitten in each hand. And I was just so happy because I love my kitties. And I don't know how old I was at the time. Doesn't say on the back. I had to have been, I'd say 10, 11 years old. And another picture at that time I have is I'm sitting with my mother. And again, it's right out here on the lawn. And I'm sure Aunt Gert was behind the camera taking a picture. Of course, these are black and white. Another thing that I need to tell you about is in the barn there wasn't only cows. There were pigs in that barn. And pigs are interesting animals. And there was a man up here that stayed a while with an old veteran of World War I, stayed here, and he said, Gertrude, I'm going to show you what to do. His name was Don Brown. He said, watch this. And he taught me that I could go down and teach a pig how to yawn. All you get to go down there and open your mouth and yawn, and you ought to see those pigs. Open their mouth, yawning away. What fun that was. Just something kind of interesting. We had entertainment. One of the things we did also was occasionally on a Saturday night, we would put on some nicer clothes and we'd go to the movies in Jeffersonville. Not always, but now and then. That was a real treat. Another thing we would do here on the farm is Bert and Rob would play horseshoes. Not with the regulation horseshoes you have today, but regular small horseshoes. I think the posts were a little bit closer together, but to see them play horseshoes, one ringer right on top of the other, and I learned to play horseshoes. One of the other things we did was we would go to visit every other Saturday, maybe not every other Saturday, but close, either to Evelyn and Al Irish's house, which is down off the main road here on 15, and they had a son, David, that was a year or two younger than I was. They would get together, the four of them, Rob and Gert and Evelyn and Al, and they would play hearts. And David and I would go out back and we'd catch fireflies and we'd just have a great time together. We would play either at his house when we were there or we'd play up here when they came here. And that was fun too. One of the other kind of interesting tidbits is we had a big grain bin in the horse barn for the horses. And it had a big old cover on it. And now and then when we were kind of bored, Teddy and I would look at each other and we'd walk into the horse barn and I'd say, Teddy, mice, mice. He'd prick his ears up and he'd be ready. I'd open that grain bin and boy, he'd jump right in there and sure enough, he'd come out with a live mouse. One less mouse to take away the grain from the horses. One other thing that would happen in the summer that was kind of interesting was their spring would dry up. The spring came from the top of the mountain behind the hill. It was at one time logged for trees, and once the trees went, it didn't hold the water there for the spring. And in the summer it would dry up, but below the house was a well. Now, the well, of course, was down over a hill. What do you think one of my little chores was? I'd have to go down with a pail and haul water up to the house, both for Aunt Gert and for whatever needed to be done in the house. That also meant that on Saturday night, we'd have a bath. I was the last one in the bathtub after my Aunt Gert because you couldn't change the water in the bathtub. There just wasn't that much water. It was interesting that in the well, my uncle always kept a trout. One of my other jobs was to catch crickets, flies, small insects, and feed the trout, which I did. Another thing that happened was we would get thunderstorms. Now that was an interesting, an interesting experience, I guess you'd call it. We had one bad one where my aunt would always insist we would sit in the middle of the dining room because they had a wall phone on one end of the dining room. Actually, it's the kitchen, not the dining room. On the kitchen wall was one of the old-fashioned wall phones. You ought to see the sparks fly out of that wall phone. And she had a big iron sink. You didn't go near that. It would snap, snap, snap. There would be fire in the corner of that sink. Scary? Yes. But the scariest thing was, I went to bed one night and we had a thunderstorm. Now we had lightning rods everywhere, and there was one right outside my window, and my window was open. The lightning hit the rod. It jumped from there into a metal bed that I was in, and there was a ball of fire that went around my bed. Don't you think that bed shook with me in it? But I was fine. Everything was okay. It's just that you never went outdoors. You were very careful during a thunderstorm. One other thing that happened is the night isn't quiet up here. We always had animals. And there was a bobcat that was in a big maple tree outside my window. And every now and then it would let out an awful screech. And don't you think that was somewhat scary? So it wasn't just lightning that would shake my bed. I'd shake the bed over the screech of a bobcat. Now, of course, summer would soon be over with. After haying was over with, next was getting the wood ready for winter, because they only burned wood stoves here, and only cooked on a wood stove, by the way. And my uncle would bring in some logs, and he had what he called a one-lunger, which is actually a one-piston gasoline engine. And I was on the other end of the saw. The saw, by the way, was like this. And it whined, and it was huge, and it sang. You could hear it sing. And he would run a piece of wood through that saw, and you would hear that engine protest. Pow, 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 until it got back up to speed. Then he'd put another piece through. I caught those pieces of wood, threw them on a pile, and then later on, what do you think I had to do? I had to stack that wood, which would last them the winter. Both in their living room, they had a big pot-bellied wood stove. In the kitchen, she had a cook stove. Later on in life, she also got a nice electric range. But boy, could beautiful meals come off that cook stove. There's a few bits and pieces we need to talk about too. That trout that's down there in that well, do you know why we put the trout down there in the well? It was because it would keep the well water clean so that it was drinkable. The other thing is how did we water the cows? There was from that well a pipe that ran under the driveway here, went all the way down to the watering trough, which was right outside the barn, for both the horses and the cows, right? So not only did the trout always keep that water clean, as I said, I had to help. Another picture I have here is Aunt Gert and my mother, a few pictures of them with their relatives, and it was at the time of my father's death. And the town here, the church here, the church women loved my aunt so much, and also my mother, because they grew up here. It was right down here in Cambridge. Well, what they call, I don't know what they call, I call it the Wrong Way Bridge. I think everybody calls it that. They survived over there in the 1927 flood. Believe it or not, Aunt Gert's parents were upstairs. They could hear the flood that came rushing through, trying to take an addition to the house, and they could hear it hit the house, hit the house, hit the house. And they did get saved. Somebody came with a boat and took them away. When it came to clean that house, the mud was everywhere. It would seep up between the cracks and everything. But they were saved. Just kind of an interesting little side note of what's going on. They had a china cabinet with the plates all in there, packed full of mud. They weren't broken. The mud kept those plates just upright and beautiful and just packed full of mud because of that flood. Now the 4th of July was quite interesting, and I think a lot of other people were looking on that we did not see. Both Rob and Bert would get together and they would buy a beautiful set of fireworks. And they let them off over here on the lawn, and it was a beautiful display. And I'm sure a lot of people could see it because we were up on a hill and there were a lot of people down below that would see these fireworks. And that was very interesting. Didn't have many holidays. And by Labor Day, I was back at home because I had to go to school. But there was always, every Sunday, every Saturday, the cows had to be milked. Everything had to be done. And everything was done. I will say this about working outside. My Uncle Rob kept every piece of equipment under a shed. Nothing was ever left out to rust or get contaminated in any way. And remember this, he had a pair of horses with a mowing machine. That's how you mowed the hay. Now, because of that, he couldn't get near the edges, and he would take a scythe. And if none of you know what a scythe is, look it up. And he would have to sharpen that scythe. And he would do it on a big, what they called whetstone. And it was run with a pedal. And he would run that scythe over that whetstone with water running on the scythe and get it to a very sharp edge so that he could cut every single blade of grass. Christmas was a wonderful time of the year because my mother, Emily, and Gertrude were sisters. And we as a family, my mother and father, my brother and I, would come up here for Christmas. Oh, what a wonderful thing that was. But one year the snow was pretty deep. We did not have four-wheel drive. We were down at the bottom of the hill. However, Uncle Rob knew we were at the bottom of the hill. We didn't have cell phones then, but he knew. I don't remember how he knew. He had to come down with a sleigh and good old Ned and Prince. And we rode up here on that sleigh and left the car at the foot of Cady Hill, all the way down by the main road, and had Christmas. Christmas here was wonderful. Gertrude had greens everywhere. The most beautiful tree, of course it was cut out of their woods, and always a beautiful balsam, perfect. Every needle was just so. Everything was beautiful. And my uncle always tended to what he called a Christmas drink. I wasn't allowed to have that Christmas drink until I was quite a bit older because it had Southern Comfort in it, which he would add some and he would just kind of chuckle, and they would have their drink and we would have whatever we had. But it was just a wonderful meal because she was an outstanding cook. She was known throughout Cambridge as one of the premier pastry cooks in the area. One of the favorite things that I remember eating was that she would put a nice roast in the oven. And we would have that for Sunday dinner. And after dinner, there was always roast beef left. And she would use that either in sandwiches or she would make a hash with it. And of course, they raised all their own potatoes and onions and everything and cooked that up, and it was absolutely delicious. And oh yes, remember, this being a working farm, the men in the morning had to have a good breakfast. That meant pie for breakfast. Can you imagine eating pie for breakfast today? By the way, this was a self-sustaining farm. They had chickens, they had pigs, they had their milk cows, and they always raised their own beef. So that here they had everything. And they would slaughter. And back many years ago, you had a freezer locker connected to a store down in the middle of Cambridge. And they would put their meat in that freezer locker. And they would go down. When they bought groceries, they would get what meat they wanted for the week and bring it up. It was interesting that during World War II there was rationing. Gasoline, sugar, things like that. Here's my aunt as a pastry cook. No, she didn't manufacture sugar, and of course you had stamps to be able to get sugar and gasoline and certain products. But she had maple sugar, and she used maple sugar in a lot of her recipes. This was a really sustaining farm. She didn't have to worry about much to really buy. They canned everything, and as I said, froze all their meat down at the freezer locker, but also they just made do. You never heard a complaint about rationing. Of course, because they used horses, they didn't have to worry about gasoline for tractors. They did have to think about gasoline because Bert was a mail carrier. So I'm sure that he had some kind of deal with the post office that he could get gas for that car, because he every day had to go out during the week and deliver mail rurally. But otherwise, everything was, there was never any concern about rationing during World War II. Not here on the farm, because they had everything. And they made do when they didn't have. And no complaints. I have one here of Aunt Gert and Uncle Rob cutting a cake, their 50th wedding anniversary. And it was a real surprise for them. And who put it on but Ruth. And Ruth was one of the hired hands' wives. And she put it on because she was almost like a daughter to Aunt Gert and Uncle Rob. And she lived here in Cambridge. Looking back, because I enjoyed Tip Top Farm so much that once I had children, I brought them up here. But we had to come up for Christmas anyway. And I know that they looked forward to every minute up here of not only seeing the cows, going around, looking at the horses, just being on a farm, a working farm, was very educational for my children. Not only that, but the fact was they welcomed, both Rob and Aunt Gert welcomed my children as though they were their own grandchildren. And they were always welcome. And no matter whenever we came up here, there was always a beautiful meal with pies and whatever she had, and cookies. Always had cookies. She always had cookies on hand for any child that came through. Nobody left here without cookies. And it was especially a great time when the children would come to at Christmas time. They just could not wait. Oh, we're going to go to the farm. We're going to see Aunt Gert and Uncle Rob. Yes, we're going to go. Christmas Day. Could not wait. We'd come up here.
Yeah, so I was quite the little tyke when we came up here. So the memories are, I don't have a lot of memories other than when we'd first come to the door. Of course, there's Aunt Gert. I was always amazed at how thin she was, but strong when she'd give me her hug, and always in an apron because she was always baking. And then stepping into the farmhouse, I was just immediately enveloped in the smells of pies and bread, and Aunt Gert would always make sure that she had peanut butter fudge for my father, because it was his favorite, as well as maple fudge. And she would somehow know what kind of pie each of us loved. So my father would have lemon meringue. I would have one of my berry pies. I mean, I don't even know how she knew, but there would be like 9 pies on the table for our family, and each one of us would have our favorite one there. So I only remember the pies. I don't remember the main course. And then Uncle Rob's friend, Don, I just vaguely remember him because he was so good to my brother and I. And we'd go off in the study while the adults were having their punch or whatever. And this was one of my favorite toys. He would pull out this little, like, aluminum frog, and it had a clacker underneath. And all he would do was he'd set it down and like, get it going. It wasn't anything to wind. I don't know how it worked, but it would just bounce across the table. And I would just be mesmerized by that. And the next thing I know, he'd be pulling a quarter out of my ear.
One of the things I love the most coming up here is I apparently managed to come up here in the fall and see the leaves turn. And I have one other memory. When my husband was alive and Rob and Gert lived here, we came up one time and they said, come up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We got something to show you outside. What in the world are they going to show me outside with all that snow? And we stood out here, and over there you could see deer walking down through. And apparently every day at 4 o'clock, those deer would walk down through, and they had a path. And of course there was such a thing as deer season. Rob didn't get many deer hunters, but there was one man that was in a wheelchair, and I can't remember his name either. But Rob would let him go up behind the house. He had a 4-wheel drive. He would get up there somehow, and he would get a deer. He'd get his wheelchair out, and he'd have his rifle, and he would get a deer. This home here was almost like an inn, it seemed to me, because relatives came up here to stay. My mother and Aunt Gert had a pair of twin brothers, and they would take their turn along with their children and come up and stay for a week or so. Just kind of interesting. And they always had a good time. Aunt Gert never complained for the extra work, because she did have extra work. She had extra cooking. Of course, there's no such thing as a dishwasher. Your dishwasher was your 2 hands. And she would get out her nice dishes, nice silverware. Never, ever, ever did I hear her ever say, oh dear, so-and-so is coming to stay. Never. She always had a smile on her face. And you know, like everybody else, she had her sufferings too. One time when I was up here, all of a sudden everything in the house was quiet. And I had to keep my mouth shut. And I had to be quiet. Aunt Gert was having a migraine headache. And she was in bed. And the shades were drawn. And I had to more or less stay outside. We couldn't make any noise until she felt better. But she never complained. But she could not do anything when she was that sick. And Uncle Rob, even though he had that wound in his leg, which was really a bad scar, he never complained, never stopped him from doing all his work, walking, hiking, whatever he had to do to chase animals, to do whatever he had to do, he could do. Wonderful, old, dyed-in-the-wool Vermonters who lived off the land, who appreciated the land, and who conserved the land.
Look at Uncle Rob and Aunt Gert meet.
Uncle Rob grew up here. It was their father that had this farm. Aunt Gert lived just a couple houses down here on Cady Hill. This was before the 1927 flood and the time that they moved down by the wrong way bridge. And they lived in a home down here. Both at that time it was known as the Krebsers. That was my grandmother and grandfather, and I had, the oldest was Edward Krebser, and then it was Gertrude Krebser Burns, and it was Emily Krebser Staple, and then the twin boys, which was Arnold and Hank, or Henry Krebser. Both the boys, well, men, I should say, moved to Connecticut, but they all grew up here, right nearby, right here on Cady Hill. And that's how Aunt Gert met Uncle Rob. When she married, she came up here and ran this household. I can't think of what else to say except that going down here, down this way was the cow barn. On the way down there was always a path, and on this side were tree roses. Now how in the world at the top of Cady Hill could you grow roses? But she had the most beautiful yellow and white roses over here that you could imagine. And then this went all the way down to the cow barn, which was just below that row of trees right there. And over here also was a sugar house. And the sugar house was there and contained everything needed to do the maple sugaring. Even though they did have a sugar shack up there, they kept all of their supplies here. Of course, not the syrup, but all of the gathering tank, the sap buckets, the sap spigots, the whole 9 yards. Remember that when they sugared, it had to be all done with wood. So not only did we cut wood for the house, we cut wood and had it stacked over at the sugar house. The horse barn, I believe that is still the horse barn. And it had that sliding door there, and it had 3 stalls over against the back wall where there was Ned and Prince, and I think my horse's name was Molly, but I'm not sure. And that's where they stayed in the wintertime and stabled in the summer unless they were brought out to do work. And the harnesses were all hung in front. As you went in that door, you could see all the harnesses hung up. And during the winter or during any time off, any repairs that had to be made, of course, Uncle Rob made them. This part of the house, from here back, that first ridge line was like a back shed. That second line over there was the equipment. It was open, but all the equipment was under there. The mowing machine, the dump rake, the whetstone, anything that had to do with farming implements was under there. And they did have the 2-car garage right where it is now, because my uncle had a car, and it's like I told you, I called him uncle, though he wasn't my uncle. Bert was a mailman, and he had his car there too. So there was always 2 cars here, as far back as I remember. Of course, one of them, I remember the Model A Ford, which makes me wonder at the time what Bert was driving on the mail route, and I don't remember that. I just remember that Model A Ford. We had a great time with that. Trying to think what else. It was around the corner of the house here where the well is, and it's still there. The well shed is still there, and it goes down a hill. Now remember, as a kid lugging water, that hill seemed like forever, but it wasn't. I came up the hill, had to come around here, go into the kitchen, and get Aunt Gert the water that she needed. And she always had water on the stove in the summer so that there would be hot water available for us. The love, the freedom, so many things I learned. Just the peace that was always between this family. There was never any arguments. I don't remember ever hearing a cross word up here, ever. And I carry that with me to this day because I try to emulate the way they lived. I think back now and say, did I take things for granted? If I did, and Aunt Gert and Uncle Rob can hear me, I'm sorry. But your memory lives on, and your love is in my heart. To this day, I love Cambridge. Memories like that never, ever leave you. They just don't. Any questions? Yes, sir.
The house that Aunt Gert lived in on Cady Hill,
Right.
is that the one that has been torn down?
That I don't know.
Or do you know what house she actually lived in?
No, I don't. She never pointed it out to me, but you might know more about that than I do.
I want to be sure I understand your question, and so far I do not understand it. The house that Aunt Gert lived in?
Yeah, the
grew up in.
Krebser family.
The Krebser family.
Krebser family.
Okay. Yes, I can talk a little about that, but when did the Krebsers move? Was it just before the flood of 27?
I don't know that.
You don't know? Okay.
No, I don't know that.
Okay.
No.
So, on the right going up is a stone foundation, which you barely can see unless you know where it is. And on the left going up is where Robbie Robinson now lives. And so that's where that Krebser home was. I would very much like to know myself the year that they moved and why they moved. I understand there was a fire there at one time, so I don't know that.
Yeah, because there's a foundation that's almost across from Robbie, that the ones that your sister has. That
Yes,
property.
that's the place. That
That's
is
the place
that
back
is the
in
place
there.
where
Okay.
the Krebsers lived.
That's
Yes.
the Crescent place. Okay.
Did you ever visit that home or no?
No,
You were
I didn't.
born after that?
Yeah, well, all I know is it was on the right-hand side
Yeah, yeah,
of
okay, then
Cady
that's
Hill.
what
I
I-
did know that, but I didn't know anything about it.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
no,
That's a mystery I gotta figure out.
This summer we'll take a walk back to the foundation.
sure.
Yeah.
Although they can very close to
Okay.
the road. Cool. Was Covey Road open all the way through to Cady Hill at that time?
The what?
Covey Road?
Oh, I remember the Covey Road. You could walk it, but no cars went over it. I remember the path to that.
Okay.
Because I would go up in there many times and I knew where it went. I never traveled all of that alone, when I was there, but yeah, but it wasn't traveled, well, what I'm saying, for cars.
Mhm.
You maybe you've been able to get a, wagon or something up through there, because I remember that road was there, yeah.
Yeah. We took four-wheel drive down through there back in the late 1980s, but
Yeah.
after that,
Can't
Yeah.
now.
you can't now, no.
I don't imagine, yeah. Mhm. It was interesting when the stories that I heard was when, I guess it was probably Uncle Rob's father began to take the trees off the top of Cady Hill, way up at the top of the mountain there. And he was warned, you get rid of those trees and you're gonna lose your water.
Wow.
And he said, nah, he wouldn't lose his water. He didn't think. And of course it did. And the water would come down and it went into a gathering tank in what was the part that was attached to it was actually their woodshed, which was attached to the house. And you would hear it start to run, and boy, remember my Aunt Gert getting very excited to see there was water coming down there. And they had a copper tank that was attached to the wood stove in the kitchen. And I am going to tell you, when that wood stove was going, that copper tank, it's a wonder it didn't come off that floor. You would hear it. And I don't remember it ever had an escape valve on it, but boy, oh boy, you didn't want to get near it. It was hot. It was very hot. And at one time, she talked about Ruthie Pollin, who was like a daughter to her, had a small child and brought the child up, of course, like Aunt Gert, and it was Aunt Gert's grandchild, so to speak, because this is the way she was. And they used to have some kerosene to start the wood stove occasionally. And what do you think it was in? A soda bottle.
Oh.
And yep, the little girl drank some. But they saved her, no problem. But I remember Aunt Gert just beating herself up over that. Oh my goodness, what was I thinking? But you didn't think about things like that. You just didn't. There weren't young children around as a rule, but she got a little bit of that in her system. And then Bobby Boudreaux was actually he was like a son to Aunt Gert and Uncle Rob. Apparently Bobby Boudreaux had an older brother that worked as a hired hand. And there was a problem, I guess there were some family problems with both of those children, and he asked Uncle Rob and Aunt Gert if Bobby could come up there and stay. This was actually before my time of being there. I did know him, but he didn't live there at the time. What was kind of interesting is, of course, we talk about those lovely angel food cakes. Well, little Bobby was somewhat of a hell terror, if you want to say so. He'd come in, if he knew there was an angel food cake in there, he'd slam the door. Of course, my aunt would come just about off her chair. There's a cake in the oven. Oh, really? But any other questions, I can answer them. I'm more than willing.
Gert, you said, you mentioned something about hired hands. Do they usually have, how many people work for them? And
They used to have, there was, of course, Bert worked the Bella route, so he did some work on the farm after he got through with. There was usually, and it was actually Henry Pollen, who was Ruth Pollen's husband, was a hired hand up there for a while. They didn't live there. She did put up a hired hand before my time. They had a big room upstairs, and the way the beds were separated was with hanging curtains in one half of the house. And they used to have hired hands live there. But that was actually before my time. And I don't remember how many jerseys he had. I think the most he had was maybe 16 or 18. But I'm going to tell you, he was really a businessman. He was. It was so interesting the way he would keep his books and everything. We could all take a leaf out of what he would do. Great. Yes, sir.
Did your aunt and uncle have any children of their own?
No, they did not. No. And my mother, who was a registered nurse, always wondered about that, because apparently when Aunt Gert was a child, my grandmother Krebser, which was Aunt Gert's mother, missed her ring. And they think she swallowed it. And I don't know if they thought it was still there, couldn't be, but you know what I'm saying. I remember my mother saying, I wonder if that did something to her. I can remember. Things you remember, you know. Yes, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I really was wondering, was there a doctor associated with the town? Do you know if Cambridge had a doctor at that point?
I did know the doctor, but I think he was in Jeffersonville, and I'll be darned if I can remember his name.
Was it Dr. Mann?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Mann. Yep. But I don't I'll never remember them going to a doctor, I'll tell you. They just didn't go to a doctor. And they were lucky, or not lucky, they were careful with their equipment and everything. They never, got cut or really injured. And it's a wonder, because I'll tell you, I remember Uncle Rob hauling stones. It seemed like these stones would erupt in the spring and he couldn't mow his grass. He'd clear all the stones out so he could get through with his mower. Yes, sir.
Two questions. One, where was the sugar bush? Was it downhill to the woods on the left?
No, you know where the sugar house was? It was up behind that, in that area. And what happened was one year there was a wicked ice storm. Now, I don't know when that would have been. I would have probably say maybe late 40s or early 50s. And it broke so many maple trees he could no longer sugar.
Oh,
wow. Okay.
Yep.
Is that what they cut off? So it was up the hill?
No, not the if you've got the house here and it's facing this way, the hill where the water came from would be over here. The sugar house where the well was would have been up that way in the back. Okay? And the maple trees were over on that area.
Okay.
And I don't know how many taps they had. I'm trying to think back how many. I have no idea. I can remember I was trying to be as big as I could, And if the buckets were too heavy, I couldn't pick them up. But if they were half full, I went over and dumped them in the gathering tank.
And then the woods that were cut, uphill when the well dried?
Yeah.
That
was done way before my time.
Okay.
So I'm maybe in the 20s. I have no idea. Okay. Yeah. Yes, sir. You had a question?
When you were haying with the horses, there's one of the fields in the far back right from the house.
Mm-hmm.
It's real steep.
Yep.
Did you traverse that with the horses sideways, or I'm thinking of how you would have?
I remember we went up it.
Yeah, so probably up.
I think we went kind of up it and kind of traversed down.
You probably remember the one I'm talking about. It was
I
pretty,
do know. Yeah. But I don't. you know, I don't ever remember having a problem, and it was probably because he really was a good teacher about how, and of course that rake, you know, was really wide. So to tip that over would have really taken something to do it.
And then the other question I had was that some of the trees up there, there's a lot of, I think they look like plantation pines. Were those planted, do you know?
No, I don't remember my uncle planting any trees.
Okay.
And maybe, you know, the people that now own it back when they first owned it could have done that. I am not sure.
Yeah, I think Leonard planted all of that.
He did, okay, yeah.
Yeah, Leonard, I couldn't remember his name, right, Leonard? Yeah, yeah.
So if that's the case, would more of that have been open fields then?
That's what I was wondering.
Oh, I don't know. I haven't been up back there, so I don't know what's open and what's not now.
Fair enough.
Can you talk a little bit about Don Brown? That's so unusual these days. You know, you don't have people.
Well, Don Brown was a very successful person in the stationery industry. I can't remember if he worked for Strathmore. I'm not sure who he worked for. But he was the one, you know, the feathered edge you have on some lovely stationery? He developed that.
Oh my goodness.
But they would never give him credit for it. And he had a son, and his son was a hiker, and he was out west and he fell to his death. So, but I felt that this business over that feathered edge on the stationery kind of broke Don. That's all I can say, that it just did him in, that he didn't get credit.
So was he older when he came to live with
Yes,
them?
he was.
Okay.
Yeah, he had white hair.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. White hair to me, no matter, you know, anybody at 12, 14 years old is old.
Yeah. And did he help on the farm? Or
No, he
just-
did not.
Yeah.
No, I think I have no idea what the arrangement was.
Yeah.
Money never was talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah. He'd go down, he'd get whatever pension and so forth, and he'd go down into Burlington for a few days. He loved going to Burlington, and he would go to the hotel and stay in the hotel for a few days. And I do have to tell you this, I love to play cribbage. And let me tell you, Uncle Bert and Uncle Rob, they played cribbage. Of course, I had my nose right in there. And I learned cribbage at a very young age.
Gert, they moved down into the village at one point, right?
Yes, they did. Well, they sold their
home. Why
home.
did they leave? Were they just, it was just time to retire, or?
Yeah, he got, he had, I believe he had a heart attack. I don't know. I think it's either a heart attack or no, it was a slight stroke. Was it a heart attack? Okay. It was a slight stroke, okay. And he gave up farming. And at that time, you know, Social Security, you know, it had just started. And they lived in the big house that as you come this way by the church in Cambridge, the big house on the left, right next to it, was where they lived. All right. And he ended up working in the store right across the road. And he would grind all the meat and things like that. And he worked there long enough that he could draw a little bit of Social Security. And Aunt Gert, later on, believe it or not, either worked at Smuggler's Notch, I believe it was, and here she was, I believe she was in her 80s. And she did, you know, change beds and do all that kind of stuff. And I can remember Ruth Pollen having a fit over it because she felt she shouldn't be doing that. And she would never go down cellar when she was alone. She's afraid she'd fall and she'd be down there. I don't go down cellar either. I have a lifeline, but I don't go down cellar. I do if I have to, but that's not very often.
Yeah.
Another little interesting tidbit. I couldn't wait to get to Cambridge, okay, after school was out. And then I'd cry a couple nights because I was homesick. Then I would go back home, right? And I would cry a couple nights because I was homesick for Cambridge. Giving out all my secrets.
How was it coming down the hill with a load of milk? You testing your brakes?
Never
on
had
it?
any problem.
No?
Well, I'll tell you, don't forget, so I was on that Model A first. You know, I mean, a Jeep was fun. And also, you know, shifted down a low gear if there was problems. The reason, it was kind of interesting because he had a bacterial count that was fairly high. Could not figure out why when he brought milk to the creamery. That's because he was first. And he realized that, so he never was first after that. In other words, even though those cans were supposed to be steamed clean, maybe it wasn't quite up to the degree of steam that they were cleaned well enough. So he always made sure it wasn't first after that. And of course, when I went, it's true, I never had to lift a can. And thank you very much for bearing with me. The memories.